and was fascinated by the gazelles. Later, Mrs. Gaddafi gave her a pair of gazelles to take home to Manila. Mrs. Marcos spent 1.5 hours touring a maternity and children's hospital, one of 61 such hospitals that have been built all over Libya since the revolution, thus tripling the number of these institutions. Last year, Libya had 6 hospital beds and 1 physician for every 1,000 persons. Highlight of the day's tour was a visit to Sabrata along the Mediterranean coast, one of 5 major archaeological sites in Libya. A museum displays a wide variety of objects excavated in the area, most of them dating from the Roman era. Sabrata was founded by the early Phoenician sailors in the 1st millennium before Christ. It was one of 3 cities in northwest Libya, together with Oea, which is the present-day Tripoli, and the better-known Leptis Magna, farther west near the Tunisian border, that was known to the early Greeks as Tripolis, a cluster of trading centers in the southern Mediterranean. The Sabrata ruins today represent the city which grew up during the first centuries of Roman rule. The Vandals sacked the city in the 5th century AD, but Roman troops retook the city, which came under Byzantine sway until the Muslim Arabs invaded the country in the 8th century. Sabrata's most outstanding ruin is a 5,000-seat Roman theater built in 180 AD and excavated in 1927. Its towering colonnaded stage has been completely restored. Of the Libyan cities from antiquity, Filipinos will recognize the place named Cyrene, the origin of Simon, the man who had helped Christ carry the cross on his way to Calvary. That night, Mrs. Marcos was entertained at an all-women dinner by Mrs. Gaddafi, who escorted her at about 10:30 to meet with President Gaddafi himself. The 34-year-old Libyan leader received Mrs. Marcos in the living room of his simple residence inside Bab Azizia barracks. Here, Mrs. Marcos handed him a letter from President Marcos in which, first of all, the Philippine president explained why he could not visit Libya with Mrs. Marcos at that time, and that was because he was engaged in the Batasang Pambansa preparations. The president also explained the policies and programs of the new society in the Philippines, particularly as they concerned the 2 million Muslim Filipinos. You can judge from this, President Marcos said, the extent and sincerity of my government's commitment to the welfare of all Filipinos without distinction or discrimination in a new society of equality and justice. As with Prime Minister Jalud, Mrs. Marcos found that her major task with President Gaddafi was to set him right on many misconceptions and misinformation about the Philippines and about the rebellion in Muslim Mindanao. She told President Gaddafi bluntly that Nur Miswari, the self-styled leader of the so-called MNLF now based in Tripoli, commanded at most 5,000 men and was hardly representative of the 2 million Muslim Filipinos. President Gaddafi accepted with pleasure President and Mrs. Marcos's invitation to visit the Philippines in order to see things for himself. By then, Mrs. Marcos's visit had been extended another day. The Philippine diplomatic and economic panels had been meeting with their Libyan counterparts all day Monday. Mrs. Marcos sat down briefly with the diplomatic panel the next day before they tackled the proposed joint communique.
To Dr. Secretary and to Mr. for all of this generosity, kindness, and warm hospitality that he has given us the last few days, and the dedication desire to make good relations between our two countries. Really, he has gone beyond the call of duty to make the Filipino and the Libyans be friends. And he is doing his utmost best to make Libya the good mediator, good Samaritan to the two countries and to the faction within the country. And for this, baby, on behalf of the Filipino people, our dedication, please accept our gratitude. Our people shall know the truth. And we hope someday we shall be able to experience the diversity in the country.
The panels came to an impasse over the paragraph referring to the Mindanao conflict in the joint communique, and were unable to agree despite a session that lasted until 3 a.m. the next day, when the Philippine delegation was scheduled to leave. Mrs. Marcos and her party were all set to leave Tripoli Wednesday morning, November 17, but a request came from President Gaddafi for Mrs. Marcos to see him a second time at his residence. Before speaking to the President privately, Mrs. Marcos presented the members of her delegation. "Thank you for taking time to see us again before we leave," she told President Gaddafi, who prevailed on her to stay another day while the impasse was resolved. Mrs. Marcos explained that the Philippines would not accept any provision in the joint communique that would legitimize the MNLF and would open the country to territorial dismemberment, as the Libyan negotiating panel had wished. President Gaddafi himself worked out the desired phraseology with Mrs. Marcos, and later asked to speak directly to President Marcos when Mrs. Marcos took a call from Malacanang inside his office. Repeatedly, President Gaddafi assured the Philippine President on the telephone, quote, "not to worry because the visit of Mrs. Marcos will be very successful," unquote. In a brief speech to the Filipinos, Gaddafi said the fighting in Mindanao was not a religious war. That war would not solve any problems, but would merely exhaust a country's resources. Libya and the Philippines are friends, he said. They are together in the third world. And he pledged to help the Philippines solve the Mindanao problem and to hasten its economic development. The first of three documents signed Thursday evening, November 17, was the joint communique summarizing the First Lady's 4-day official visit. Mrs. Marcos signed for the Philippines, Minister Al-Treki for Libya. There were two versions of its document, one in Arabic and an English text which was a direct transliteration of the Arabic. The communique signaled the establishment of diplomatic relations between the two countries, with exchange of ambassadors to follow at the earliest possible time. The controversial paragraph finally declared that the Libyan government, quote, "expressed its satisfaction for the positions of the government of the Philippines and that of the liberation fronts of Muslims, be it Moro or elsewhere, in accepting all the resolutions of the Islamic Conference aiming at finding a just solution acceptable to both parties concerned," unquote. Mrs. Marcos also signed a cultural exchange agreement before giving way to Secretary of Industry Vicente Paterno, who signed the agreement on economic, technical, and scientific cooperation for the Philippines. Libya needs Philippine sugar, coconut oil, and hardwoods, as well as managerial manpower for construction and industry, medical personnel, and development workers. After the signing, Minister Al-Treki told Mrs. Marcos that it was the first time President Gaddafi had ever taken a hand in drafting a joint communique, although last year alone, Libya welcomed some 200 foreign missions. The Filipino delegation finally left Tripoli on Thursday, November 18. Again, Mrs. Gaddafi was delegated to escort Mrs. Marcos. The two first ladies and their friends had enjoyed an intimate little hen party at Hospitality Palace the night before, but they still were to spend another hour chatting at the airport before Mrs. Marcos finally left. In coming to Libya, Mrs. Marcos said of her mission, "I staked my entire diplomatic record for the sake of peace in Mindanao. Let us now look forward to achieving that peace as we welcome a new dawn in the relations between Libya and the Philippines."